They came in the dead of night, cutting their engines as they glided toward German positions, their wooden biplanes whispering through the darkness like ghosts. The only sound the enemy soldiers would hear was a soft whooshing, like a witch's broomstick sweeping through the air before the bombs began to fall. The German troops called them Nachthexen, the night witches. These were the women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, and they became one of the most feared units on the Eastern Front during World War II. Young Soviet women, many barely out of their teens, who flew flimsy canvas and plywood planes on suicide missions night after night, racking up thousands of sorties and leaving psychological scars on battle-hardened Wehrmacht soldiers who had conquered most of Europe. This is their story, a tale of courage that defied every expectation, of women who transformed themselves into warriors when their homeland needed them most, and of a legacy that would be deliberately buried and forgotten for decades after the war ended. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Soviet Union faced annihilation. 3 million German troops poured across the border, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, in the largest military invasion in human history. The blitzkrieg tactics that had crushed Poland and France now turned eastward, and within months the Germans had captured vast swaths of Soviet territory, enslaved millions, and stood at the gates of Moscow. The Red Army was reeling, desperate for any advantage, any resource, any weapon that could slow the Nazi advance. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, whose purges had gutted the military's officer corps just years before, now faced an existential crisis. The Soviet Union needed every able body it could find, and that meant reconsidering long-held assumptions about who could fight. Enter Marina Raskova, a woman who was already a legend in Soviet aviation. Before the war, Raskova had become the Soviet Union's most famous aviatrix, setting multiple world records for long-distance flight. In 1938, she had been part of a 3-woman crew that flew from Moscow to the Russian Far East, covering over 3,000 miles in a harrowing journey that made them international celebrities. Raskova was more than a pilot. She was a national hero, and she had the ear of Stalin himself. As German forces pushed deeper into Soviet territory, and the call went out for every able-bodied man to join the fight, thousands of Soviet women volunteered to serve. They wanted to fly combat missions, to defend their homeland with the same ferocity as their male counterparts. But the Soviet military, like every military in the world at that time, had no place for women in combat aviation. The very idea seemed absurd to most commanders, a dangerous fantasy that would get people killed. Marina Raskova thought differently. She knew these women could fly. Many were already experienced pilots, navigators, and mechanics from the USSR's extensive network of civilian flying clubs. She began lobbying Stalin directly, arguing that the Soviet Union couldn't afford to waste any resource, including the talents of its women. In October 1941, with German troops less than 100 miles from Moscow, Stalin gave his approval. Raskova was authorized to form 3 all-female aviation regiments: a fighter regiment, a bomber regiment, and a night bomber regiment. They would be trained, equipped, and sent into combat alongside male units. It was a revolutionary decision born of desperation, and it would create some of the most remarkable combat pilots of the entire war. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment was the smallest and, in many ways, the most unusual of these units. While the fighter and day bomber regiments would eventually be integrated with male pilots and support staff, the 588th remained entirely female throughout the war. Pilots, navigators, mechanics, armorers, everyone. They were equipped with Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes, ancient training aircraft that had been designed in 1928 and were already obsolete when the war began. These planes were never meant for combat. They were built of plywood and canvas, with open cockpits that exposed the crew to temperatures that could drop to 40 degrees below zero. They had no radios, no guns to defend themselves, no parachutes, no armor plating. Each plane could carry only 2 small bombs under its wings, meaning they had to fly multiple missions every night to make any impact. Their top speed was barely 90 miles per hour, slower than most German fighters, and they could fly no higher than 10,000 feet. By any conventional military standard, these planes were death traps, utterly unsuitable for combat operations. But the women of the 588th would transform these limitations into advantages through sheer ingenuity and courage. The Po-2's slow speed and maneuverability meant it could turn inside German fighters that tried to intercept it. Its ability to fly low meant it could navigate by visual landmarks even on the darkest nights, and its wooden construction made it nearly invisible to radar. The women developed tactics that exploited every quirk of their primitive aircraft. They would approach their targets at altitude, then cut their engines and glide silently toward German positions. The canvas skin of the wings would produce that distinctive whooshing sound as they descended, but by the time the enemy soldiers heard it and scrambled for cover, the bombs were already falling. The Germans, who had grown accustomed to the roar of engines warning them of air attacks, found this silence terrifying. You couldn't hear them coming until it was too late, and then the night would erupt in explosions. The missions were relentless and brutal. Each crew consisted of a pilot and a navigator who sat in separate open cockpits. They would take off at dusk and fly mission after mission throughout the night, sometimes making 15 or 20 sorties before dawn. Between missions, they would land, refuel, reload bombs, and take off again within minutes. There was no rest, no respite. The cold was unbearable. These young women would fly in temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in seconds, wearing whatever warm clothing they could scavenge since the military had no winter flight gear designed for women. Their faces would be covered in frostbite sores. Their hands would be so numb they could barely grip the controls. Some nights the cold was so extreme that the mechanics had to keep the engines running between missions because they couldn't be restarted once they cooled down. The German response to these attacks was savage. Once they realized that Soviet night bombers were operating in their sector, German forces would throw up intense anti-aircraft fire. Filling the night sky with tracers and flak, the Po-2s had no armor, so a single bullet or shrapnel fragment could bring one down. The planes were so fragile that they could be torn apart by the shockwave from their own bombs if they dropped them from too low an altitude. Yet the women kept flying, night after night, knowing that the odds were stacked impossibly against them. Some crews flew more than 1,000 missions during the war. Let that sink in. 1,000 times climbing into a flimsy canvas and wood plane, flying into hell, and somehow making it back. The psychological toll was immense. These young women watched their friends die in front of them, saw planes explode mid-air or spiral down in flames. They learned to navigate by the glow of burning villages and to ignore the screams over the radio when another crew went down. What made them do it? The answer lies in understanding the existential nature of the war on the Eastern Front. This wasn't a conflict over territory or ideology in the abstract. It was a war of extermination. The Nazi invasion wasn't just about conquering the Soviet Union. It was about enslaving and murdering its population as part of Hitler's plan for Lebensraum, living space for the German people. Millions of Soviet civilians were being systematically killed, starved, or worked to death. Entire villages were being wiped off the map. Every woman in the 588th had seen what the Germans were doing to their country. Many had lost family members. They flew knowing that if they didn't stop the German advance, everyone they loved would likely die. This wasn't about glory or adventure. It was about survival, about defending their homes and families against an enemy that had shown no mercy. The Germans came to fear the night witches with an intensity that seems almost irrational until you understand the psychological warfare at play. German soldiers on the Eastern Front were already exhausted, cold, and demoralized by the grinding nature of the war. The initial blitzkrieg victories had given way to brutal attritional combat against an enemy that refused to surrender. Then, night after night, they would be subjected to these harassing attacks that denied them rest and sleep. The bombs themselves weren't particularly destructive. Each Po-2 could only carry small munitions, but the psychological impact was devastating. You couldn't see the planes coming. You couldn't hear them until the last second. You couldn't shoot them down easily, because they flew so low and slow that standard tactics didn't work. German fighters would overshoot them, unable to slow down enough to get a clean shot. Anti-aircraft guns would fire wildly into the darkness, often hitting nothing. The attacks came all night long, preventing sleep and fraying nerves to the breaking point. German soldiers began to dread nightfall, knowing the witches would. The German command took the threat seriously enough to offer decorations and automatic promotions to any pilot who shot down a Po-2. The Iron Cross was promised to anyone who could bring down one of these sewing machines, as the Germans derisively called them because of the sound their engines made. They would approach in groups of 3. The first plane would draw German fire, flying over the target and attracting searchlights and anti-aircraft guns. While the Germans were focused on this decoy, the second plane would swoop in from another direction with its engine cut, drop its bombs, and disappear before anyone realized what had happened. If the Germans caught on and split their fire, the third plane would attack from yet another angle. It was guerrilla warfare in the air, using coordination and cunning to overcome technological inferiority. One of the most remarkable aspects of the 588th was how young most of these women were. Many were in their late teens or early 20s when they joined, barely adults, thrust into a role that would have broken most people. Nadezhda Popova was just 19 when she joined the regiment, and she would go on to fly 852 combat missions, more than almost any other Soviet pilot, male or female. She survived multiple crashes and had her plane shot full of holes so many times she lost count. On one mission, her plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire and caught fire mid-flight, rather than bail out over German-held territory where she would almost certainly be captured and killed. She and her navigator managed to control the burning aircraft long enough to glide back over Soviet lines before crash landing. Both women survived with severe burns, and after recovering, Popova insisted on returning to combat. This wasn't an isolated incident of courage. It was typical of the women in this unit. The casualties were staggering. Of the roughly 400 women who served in the 588th over the course of the war, 32 were killed in action. That might not sound like many compared to the millions who died in the war overall, but consider what it meant. These women flew together, lived together, formed bonds that were stronger than family. When a plane didn't come back, everyone in the regiment felt it. There was no time to grieve properly. They had to fly again that same night, knowing they might be next. Some crews were killed on their first or second mission. Others survived hundreds of sorties only to die near the end of the war. The randomness of death was perhaps the hardest thing to bear. You could do everything right and still get hit by a lucky shot from the ground. You could be the best pilot in the regiment and still have your engine fail at the worst possible moment. Yet somehow, morale in the unit remained high. The women developed a fierce esprit de corps, a sense that they were part of something historic and important. They took pride in their accomplishments, in the fear they inspired in the enemy, in the knowledge that they were proving wrong everyone who had said women couldn't fight. They gave themselves the nickname Night Witches with a mixture of dark humor and defiance, embracing the German epithet and wearing it as a badge of honor. Between missions, they would sing songs, tell jokes, comfort each other through the trauma. They formed relationships that would last for the rest of their lives. Some found romance within the unit or with soldiers they encountered. The war compressed lifetimes into months, making everything more intense, more immediate. The Soviet military establishment never quite knew what to make of them. While the regiment was respected for its combat effectiveness, there was always an undercurrent of condescension from male commanders who saw the women as auxiliaries rather than true combat pilots. The 588th was never given the resources or recognition afforded to male units. They had to make do with cast-off equipment, scrounging for everything from spare parts to winter clothing. When male bomber regiments were upgraded to more modern aircraft, the 588th was stuck with their obsolete Po-2s throughout the war. This wasn't just oversight. It reflected a deeper prejudice about women's capabilities. Even as these women were proving themselves in combat night after night, racking up thousands of successful missions, they were still viewed by many in the military hierarchy as something of a propaganda stunt rather than a legitimate combat unit. The tide of the war began to turn in 1943 after the Soviet victory at Stalingrad. The German advance had been stopped, and now the Red Army was pushing west, slowly reclaiming occupied territory. The Night Witches flew throughout this counteroffensive, supporting Soviet ground forces as they drove toward Germany. Their missions evolved. Instead of just harassing German positions, they were now conducting tactical bombing runs to support specific operations, dropping supplies to partisan forces behind enemy lines, and evacuating wounded soldiers from forward areas. The intensity never let up. If anything, the missions became more dangerous as the Germans became more desperate. But the women of the 588th had become hardened veterans by this point, their skills honed by thousands of hours of combat flying. They knew every trick, every tactic that could keep them alive. New recruits who joined the regiment would be mentored by pilots who had survived hundreds of missions, learning the hard-won lessons that meant the difference between life and death. As Soviet forces pushed into Eastern Europe and eventually into Germany itself, the 588th was there, flying missions over Poland, Romania, Hungary, and finally, Germany proper. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the regiment had flown more than 23,000 combat sorties and dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs. 23 of the women were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military decoration, with many others receiving various medals and commendations. They had earned their place in history through blood and sacrifice, proving that courage and skill had nothing to do with gender. They had been part of one of the greatest military victories in history, the defeat of Nazi Germany, and they had done it flying planes that most people wouldn't trust to get off the ground. But then something strange happened. After the war ended, the story of the Night Witches was gradually suppressed and forgotten. Stalin's regime, always ambivalent about women in combat roles, decided that the post-war Soviet Union needed women to return to traditional roles to rebuild the population and serve the state as mothers and workers rather than warriors. The women of the 588th, along with the other female aviators who had served, found themselves sidelined. Most were not allowed to continue flying in the post-war Soviet Air Force. They were given civilian jobs, often menial ones that had nothing to do with their skills or experience. When they tried to talk about their wartime service, they were often met with skepticism or dismissal. Soviet official histories of the war mentioned them only in passing, if at all. The propaganda value of the female aviators had been useful during the war, but in peacetime, their story didn't fit the narrative the regime wanted to promote. For decades, the Night Witches were nearly forgotten, their story known only to military historians and the aging veterans themselves. The women would gather occasionally for reunions, sharing memories that no one else seemed interested in hearing. Some wrote memoirs, but these were rarely published or translated. It wasn't until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that their story began to emerge more fully. Historians gained access to previously classified military archives, and veterans felt free to speak more openly about their experiences. Books and documentaries started to appear, finally giving these women the recognition they deserved. In Russia today, the Night Witches are celebrated as heroes, with monuments and museums dedicated to their memory. But in the West, they remain relatively unknown, overshadowed by other World War II stories that have received more attention. The legacy of the Night Witches extends beyond their combat achievements. They challenged fundamental assumptions about what women could do, about who could be a warrior, about the nature of courage itself. They proved that physical strength wasn't the only thing that mattered in combat, that intelligence, adaptability, and sheer determination could overcome tremendous disadvantages. They showed that women could function under extreme stress, could make life and death decisions in split seconds, could lead and inspire others in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Every woman who has served in combat since, in any military, owes something to these Soviet pilots who kicked down doors and refused to accept the limitations others tried to place on them. They did it without fanfare or recognition, often in the face of hostility and condescension from their own side. They did it because their country needed them, and because they refused to be told they weren't capable. Today, as we look back at World War II, we tend to focus on the big battles, the famous generals, the technological innovations. We remember D-Day and the atomic bomb, Patton and Rommel, the battles that shape the course of nations. But war is also made of smaller stories, of individual acts of courage that never made the headlines. The Night Witches represent one of these forgotten stories, a reminder that history is full of remarkable people whose contributions have been overlooked or deliberately erased. These young Soviet women flying their fragile canvas planes into the darkness night after night, facing death with every mission, deserve to be remembered not just as a historical curiosity, but as exemplars of human courage. They were ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet the challenge. They were terrified and brave, vulnerable and fierce, human in all the ways that matter. And they changed history, one mission at a time, proving that heroes come in forms we don't always expect, and that courage has no gender.